مساء الخير. Hello everyone, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. This is the 7th and the last session of the season of our seminar, Exploring Egypt, Histories and Historiographies. And this is a joint collaboration between the Ifao and the German Archaeological Institute, and organized by my colleague Malak and myself. And I give the floor to Malak to introduce our speaker today.
Well, thank you very much, Farida, for accepting to speak at the last session of our seminar. So just to introduce Farida Makkar, many of you know her already. So Farida she holds a PhD in history from St. Antony's College, University of Oxford. She's currently a postdoctoral associate member at the history faculty at the University of Oxford as well. And her research focuses on Egyptian teachers and their adoption of progressive education during the first half of 20th century, right? And she's the author of Educational Institutions and John Dewey in Early 20th Century Egypt, and she's also the co-author of Egyptian textbooks in Times of Change, 1952-1980s, which was published in 1921 at the Arab Studies Journal, and her talk today will be partly based on this article. Thank you very much, Farida.
Good evening. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Thank you, Malak and Fatma, for the invitation, and many thanks to all the organizers at the Ifao. I'm delighted to be with you and to have this opportunity to present some of the findings from this article that I co-authored and published together with Dr. Ehaab Abdou back in 2021. And I'd like to say that the findings from this article have practically nothing to do with my PhD dissertation. This is a prior project that I was working on, so please bear with me. So I'd like to preface my presentation by saying that this article was written over a very long period of time between 2012 and 2021, where both Ehaab and myself independently did our research at the Ministry of Education's archive, which is in Munira, without planning necessarily on collaborating on a piece. But when we did come together and when we compared notes, it became very evident that our initial instincts about the material was shared. So Egyptian textbooks are often accused of bearing, by design, instructions on how to become good citizens and of containing a kind of nationalist content. We have the work of countless scholars on this, including Hania Sobhi, Atif Boutros al-Attar, and many others. But Ehaab and I were particularly interested in how it is that textbooks come to embody nationalist narratives following the 1952 revolution. And in what ways did such narratives change over time? Or did they change over time? That was also one of the questions. We, of course, acknowledge the homogenizing power of textbooks and their importance to any regime of power, but we wanted to adopt a methodological framework that questions the sort of matter-of-fact causal relationship between political power and content. So in other words, there's a consensus almost when you say textbook, oh yes, the textbooks always reflect the power of the state or their discourses. But it was very important for us to try to find out how it is that they come to embody these narratives, and what are the complicated ways in which we find ourselves with the narrative at the end in the textbook. So we originally sought to answer the questions about narrative change post-1952 by examining only history textbooks published in the wake of two key moments of regime change, the 1952 revolution and Sadat's ascension to power. So in other words, we were going to just capture the books from the academic year, let's say 1952, 1953, and then 1970, 1971, and that would have given us the results that we wanted done. Was not that easy. So we assumed we would find these sudden narrative alterations after each of these political changes. However, early visits to the Ministry of Education's archive quickly proved that we could not neatly map the textbook narratives onto moments of political change. Instead, these textbooks seemed to have their own logic and their own life cycle. We therefore adopted a new time frame of investigation dictated in part by the textbooks themselves, 1952 all the way up until 1980. And this allowed us to address a gap in the existing literature, which tends to focus on narrow time periods or tends to focus on the pre-52 era. So if you look at the historiography on Egyptian textbooks, a lot has been produced about the pre-52 period or about the contemporary period that we're in, but there isn't this sort of long approach to textbook development. So to sum up, we analyze all pre-university history textbooks published by the Ministry of Education between 52 and 1980. And we also considered the pre-52 textbooks just for comparative purposes. So just to make sure, you know, when we were thinking, oh, this is something new, just to make sure that it was something new, we compared it to the pre-52 period. So our work is divided into two parts. Our work is divided into two parts. First, we provide a contextual analysis, which asks who wrote the texts, what positions did they have within the Ministry of Education, when and for how long did the ministry use their texts, because that's also very important and that tends to be forgotten. By asking questions about textbook authors and their relationship to the ministry, our study builds on the existing literature on curriculum studies. The starting point of our investigation here was Laurie Brand's seminal work on nationalist narratives from Nasser to Mubarak, which analyzes textbooks alongside other sources and argues that such an analysis is vital to demonstrate the range of tools employed by regimes to reinforce their image and legitimize their rule. However, the broader literature does not delve into the bureaucratic structures that produce textbooks. So by examining the understudied bureaucratic history of the ministry, the role of state functionaries, and the historiographical orientations of the authors, we capture the complicated ways in which nationalist narratives permeated school textbooks. So that's the big contextual analysis. But secondly, we present a textual analysis of the history textbooks themselves. So we explore the narrative shifts by looking at 4 types of changes: continuities, revival and change, omissions, and additions. So based on our longitudinal analysis, this article makes 3 central arguments. First, we argue that textbook content must be considered alongside continuities and ruptures in textbook authorship and the larger bureaucratic context in order to effectively trace change over time. Second, we maintain that textbook content did not instantly mirror changes in political discourse. Rather, bureaucratic and pedagogical considerations, such as continuities in authorship, bureaucratic inertia, or the introduction of the preparatory level, which I will talk about in a bit, were oftentimes far more instrumental in maintaining a consistent message on the one hand, and/or introducing novel ideas on the other. Finally, we argue that with the exception of the preparatory level textbooks, the development of brand new books was infrequent, as most textbooks survived for decades. So now we'll start talking about the larger contextual analysis and looking at the bureaucracy and the authors, and we've neatly titled this section of our paper Chercher l'auteur, because nobody actually looks at who writes these textbooks. So in this section, we start off with the pre-52 period, so the period between 1923 and 1952. And this period is we've kind of titled it ad hoc committees, and I'll explain why in a bit. So between 1923 and 1952, 25 different ministers led the Ministry of Education. So it's a very short period of time with a lot of turnover. Beneath this rapid turnover of leadership, the ministry relied on a core group of trusted individuals who formed ad hoc committees for textbook preparation. So during this period, there was a clear absence of a unified textbook development strategy. The ministry sometimes directly commissioned authors to produce specific textbooks, and other times it would announce a competition for the development of a particular textbook. And that's why it was a bit ad hoc. Despite this sort of volatile nature of the process, the constant participation by an insiders club of ministry inspectors and advisors ensured a certain level of continuity in the content. Historian Iman Farag suggests that in the early 20th century, the ministry's inspectors came to play an increasingly pivotal role in the development of history textbooks. They were graduates of the most prestigious teacher training colleges, often specialized in history, and subsequently obtained scholarships to continue their education abroad. But following the Egyptian university's establishment and the gradual professionalization of the discipline of history in the 1920s, these history degree holders, these local history degree holders, also began to author textbooks. And they could develop textbooks either by acquiring an additional degree from the Institute of Pedagogy or becoming a professional academic historian. In other words, there were sort of two ways that you could end up in this position of being an inspector who is charged with writing the textbook. So the following list of textbooks produced roughly between 1925 and 1949 substantiates Farag's analysis. The Ministry of Education produced 5 main texts for primary schools, and just to give you a sense, the primary schools were usually 4 years, so it was 4 years of primary school, and 10 textbooks for the secondary schools, which lasted for 5 years. And so I'd like to sort of draw your attention to the names of the authors that are prominent. For example, the name of Muhammad Abdurrahim Mustafa, Mustafa Duqmeri, Muhammad Rifat, Muhammad Shafiq Ghurbel, and so I'm mentioning these particular names because I will mention them in 2 seconds and just want you to remember them. So the authors who prepared these primary and secondary textbooks belong to what we will call the earlier generation of textbook authors. Most of them were, as I said earlier, ministry inspectors. 2 of them were academic historians, and every single one had ties to the ministry in one way or another. So for example, Muhammad Shafiq Ghurbel, I'm sure many of you know who this is. He began his career as a high school teacher and later became instrumental in the development of ministerial policies. Ghurbel was Egypt's most celebrated and academic historian, and he was the doyen of Egyptian historiography. And at the Egyptian University, he developed an ideology of professionalism, which distinguished his school of history from popular and amateur historians by encouraging the use of archival sources and meticulous footnoting. So Ghurbel himself trained the next generation of Egyptian historians, and we will talk about this in a second. And secondary schools used his textbooks for over 20 years. Muhammad Rifat, who wrote 5 of the 15 textbooks listed above, followed the trajectory typical of his generation also. So like Ghurbel, he graduated from Madrasat al-Muallimin and obtained a Master of Arts in History from the University of Liverpool in 1915. And then he spent his career between the ministry and the Egyptian University. Lesser known but equally important were Muhammad Abdurrahim Mustafa and Ibrahim Saifuddin, who spent their careers within the ministry as inspectors and together authored half of the list's history textbooks. So schools used their textbooks for over 30 years, and their influence lasted well after 1952. And they're a bit more obscure than the first 2 authors that I just mentioned. So because of the multiplicity of authorial voices that we can see in the sort of selection of textbooks in front of us, we can sort of say that that history content in some way captured the relative plurality which existed during the parliamentary period. So there was both a kind of non-centralized way of producing these textbooks. You had different authors producing different ideas, and that kind of mirrors the larger political context that existed at the time. So then we move to phase 2, which is experimentation. In phase 2, we're talking about the period roughly between 52 and 58. And of course, this is an arbitrary sort of period that we decided made sense, and you can tell us if you think it also makes sense. So the existing literature portrays the 1952 revolution as a decisive rupture in textbook content, suggesting that the new military-led regime was quick to alter textbooks. Within this literature, the appointment of Free Officer Kamal ad-Din Hussein as Minister of Education in 54 was considered the final nail in the coffin for textbook plurality. For example, historian Yoram Meital argues that a new political line was evident in textbooks as early as 1 year into military rule. In other words, the revolution happens in 52, and then you come to school on, in September 1st, 1952, and boom, you have a new narrative, right? So the evidence that Meital produces is a chapter in a 1953 secondary school Arabic language textbook, whose title he translates as the nationality of the student, but the actual title is Wataniyat al-Tilmidh, so I would translate it differently, but that's okay. But the chapter Wataniyat al-Tilmidh, and this is something that Meital is not aware of, had actually appeared in an Arabic textbook in 1940, the exact same text, right? And so it's not some sort of a novelty that emerged in this post-52 moment, it's actually a text that existed before. Laurie Brand also suggests that textbook committees changed history content early on, but Brand references only one particular textbook called Tarikh Misr fil Asr al-Hadith from 1954. But what we wanted to do was, instead of select these like random sporadic textbooks, we wanted to examine all the history textbooks between 1950 and 1960 and also compare them to their predecessors. And in both the primary and secondary levels, these textbooks, as you will see in a second, these textbooks included the authors from the earlier generation, such as Muhammad Abdurrahim Mustafa Duqmeri, and then a few newcomers who I will talk about, Abdul Hamid al-Batriq, Muhammad Wasif Homs, Mustafa al-Shahabi, and Abu al-Futuh Radwan. So if we take a look at this list that you have in front of you, these are the books that were authored roughly between 52 and 58. I cite some of the texts that were authored earlier in the 1930s, for example, because they continued to be used up until the mid-50s, and that's important to bear in mind. So judging by the year of publication alone, it appears as though the new textbooks coincided with political turning points. So you will notice there are new textbooks that emerge in 56 or in 54, right? So one might think, oh yes, of course, 56, Suez Crisis, new textbook. No. Supporting the arguments of Meital and others. But the persistence of these textbook authors across this period complicates this sort of analysis or judgment. So academic historians from the pre-52 period, such as Shafiq Ghurbel and Muhammad Rifat, remained moderately influential until the mid-50s, when schools stopped teaching their works. But one can say that Ghurbel's influence actually was sustained indirectly through his students, Ahmad Izzat Abdul Karim, Abdul Hamid al-Batriq, and Abdul Aziz al-Shinnawi. And this trio represented the new generation of textbooks that I alluded to earlier. While many earlier generation historians gradually disappeared from the list, ministry inspectors did not. In fact, inspectors Ibrahim Saifuddin, Muhammad Abdurrahim Mustafa, and Ahmad Hassouna were the leading authors throughout this time period, suggesting a certain degree of continuity. The second complication arises when we consider these dates not as political turning points, but as bureaucratic and pedagogical ones. While political considerations most certainly had a bearing on the choice of new authors, the establishment of the preparatory school, an entirely new school level, produced many of the new textbooks published in 53, 54, and 56. So I'm going to explain this in a bit. So the ministry began discussing the importance of a preparatory school in the late 1940s. And through Law 142 of 51, it established the preparatory level, but it was still within the secondary schools, al-Madaris al-Sanawiyya. Then a series of laws in 53 separated this level into its own school, and then that particular school became fully independent in 56. So that the Madaris I'dadiyya that we know today, they came into existence officially in 1956. So when you create this kind of shift, you have to rearrange the textbooks for the lower levels, and the higher would have previously been in the primary school or in the secondary school. And so you have to produce new books for this level. And so this is what we begin to see, is that the other levels receive new textbooks because there's this shift that happens, and it's not necessarily because of the political context. Establishing the preparatory level provided an opportunity for the ministry to experiment with new textbook committees, invite a new generation of authors, such as Ghurbel's trio students that I mentioned, and introduce new content. So these authors introduced ideas that were, of course, compatible with the day's political discourse. But the important thing here is that the preparatory level school textbooks were the first to reflect the shift in tone, precisely because they were new and fresh. And also it's important to note that during the period between 54 and 1960, so in just a matter of 6 years, there were 14 new textbooks that were published for the preparatory levels. So this was a level that was continuously in flux, and there was a lot of experimentation. So I'd like to here just very quickly mention that the textbook that was mentioned by Laurie Brand, which was authored by Abu al-Futuh Radwan, etc., that was a preparatory school level textbook. So the one example that she uses as signaling a shift in narrative was actually a preparatory school textbook. And yeah, just also to mention that, you know, people like Saifuddin and Abdurrahim Mustafa and Muhammad Rifat continued to author also throughout this period. And then finally, the final kind of example that complicates this idea that political discourse and textbook discourse are always aligned was the case of Ghurbel's student Abdelaziz al-Shenawi. So in 1955, the Nasser regime accused Shenawi of espionage. They arrested him and tortured him and for having smuggled important historical documents pertaining to the Suez Canal to France on the eve of the Suez Crisis. So even though Shenawi spent 2 years in prison, the ministry did not discontinue using the history textbook he co-authored for the preparatory level in 1954 or omit his name. So in fact, the schools used this textbook at least until 1959. So this sort of, you know, the idea that we have is that you have to look at the context, but also look at the text, right? And what we found here was that very often the changes that we talk about in terms of content were simply a matter of changing the book's title while retaining the same content. So for example, the 1955 primary school history textbook authored by Saifuddin was originally titled صور من التاريخ المصري, or Images from Egyptian History, and it became صور من التاريخ القومي, Images from Nationalist History. Far from constituting a major shift in the narrative, it was just a matter of conveniently changing the words to sort of recycle old content. And in the words of Abu al-Futuh Radwan, who was cited by Iman Farag, quote, "The popular revolutionary orientation has allowed the authors to see things that they could not see in the past. Texts once titled Muhammad Ali, founder of modern Egypt, became the affirmation of national consciousness and the role of the people in the ascension of Muhammad Ali to power." End quote. So changes to the history textbooks in the 50s did not immediately mirror radical political ruptures, rather a combination of factors, including the introduction of the preparatory school and bureaucratic inertia, and also the kind of convenience of using tried and tested content, sort of superseded. So then we reach the final phase, which is the phase of control, 58 to 1980. The founding of the United Arab Republic, the UAR, which joined Egypt and Syria together in one political union, was a much more significant rupture in the history of textbook content, because it marked the beginning of new limitations on textbook plurality. The UAR necessitated the restructuring of the ministry to oversee educational policies in both countries, And so the Cairo-based Central Ministry of Education prepared policies to be implemented by two executive ministries, one in Damascus and one in in Damascus and one in Cairo. Kamal ad-Din Hussein became Central Minister of Education, and Ahmed Naguib Hashim, a leading textbook author from the pre-52 period, by the way, was appointed Executive Minister in Cairo. So the UAR created both a political opportunity and a bureaucratic necessity for the Nasser regime to further unify its education policies. As Central Minister, Kamal ad-Din Hussein increased levels of standardization and subjected all related government entities to oversight. In 6061, the Central Ministry of Education issued its first 5-year plan for education, which resulted in unified textbook content. And in 59, ministerial decrees established permanent and temporary curriculum revision committees to ensure that textbooks were in compliance with the overall education strategy and prepare textbooks for each subject. So this was significant because until then, textbooks had not been all revised at the same time. I don't know if you know the difference, but usually there will be a decision to change, let's say, the mathematics curriculum for one particular year, and you'll invite people to change that. But at no point until then was everything changed at the same time until the late 50s when this happened. And then there's a pamphlet that was published by the Central Ministry of Education, which explained the rationale behind the changes. And this is what was written in the pamphlet, quote, "The ministry has sought to unify curricula in Egypt and Syria with the purpose of creating a new generation of Arabs that believes in God and the nation and supports the cultural unity of the northern and southern regions of the UAR." And it's important to note that the Central Ministry of Education excluded books that it deemed, quote, dangerous for students. So those who rejected this new trend, most notably Ghorbel and others, lost their influence. But authors such as Ahmed Izzat Abdel Karim, Al-Batrik, and Abu al-Futuh Radwan, so this new generation, who came to embrace the new historiographical trends, survived the ministry's reform efforts. In primary schools, only 3 new textbooks emerged in 1960, one by newcomers Anwar al-Rifai and Amina Arif, a second by Hassan Jawhar, and a third by Inspector Saifuddin. So Saifuddin, the ministry inspector from the pre-52 period, was there in the transitional period and then also emerged as a textbook author later on in the 60s. So I'm just going to skip through this. No, but it's important for you to know that the textbook that was authored by Ahmed Izzat Abdel Karim for the secondary school remained in use until 1991. Okay, so that's also very important. That's why, I don't know if you've had this experience, but when I was studying history, my parents would always say, oh, that was the same book that we had. I don't know if you had that, but this is why. Anyway, and in the Sadat years, many of the same advisors and academics who survived the state's massive unification efforts continued to author textbooks. And so this whole process demonstrates the slow and complicated nature of textbook development, the power of bureaucratic inertia, and the convenience and appeal of tried and tested content. Okay, I hope you're not falling asleep, because now we're going to shift to the actual textual analysis, so looking at the textbooks themselves. So as stated earlier, we organized our textual analysis around forms of change, continuities, revival and change, additions, and omissions. By continuities, we mean something very specific. We mean the existence of an era-spanning meta-narrative which provided answers to questions of time, space, and subjectivity through what Ehaab Di Capua identifies as the founder paradigm. So Di Capua argues that the Egyptian historians, and he's mostly talking about academic historians, but we found that this very much applied to these people who were writing the textbooks for school. So he argues that Egyptian historians gradually adopted the founder paradigm at the turn of the 20th century, marking an intellectual transition towards a modern historical worldview. The paradigm espouses an understanding of time from the point of view of the future, in which history is understood as a process and time itself is moving to an end progression. It also considers the modern borders of Egypt as the site of history and the Egyptian state founded by Muhammad Ali as its main subject. So one of the paradigm's more hidden assumptions is the idea of an unchanging Egyptian character that transcends time and space. So we found that all of these elements of the founder paradigm existed in the textbooks that we analyzed. For example, I'm going to give very few examples because we don't have a lot of time. So as of the 1960s, textbooks began to project socialist and Arab nationalist narratives popularized by Nasser's regime into ancient history. So this is this idea of using the future to understand the past, or projecting tropes or ideas from the present into a past where they did not exist. So Saifuddin's textbook from 1960 suggests that King Mina, founder of the early dynastic period, waged wars to protect the Nile Valley against raiding tribes who were abusing workers and peasants. A 1969 textbook suggested that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, established a new socialist society in Medina, socialist, and that early Arab Muslim dynasties adopted a socialist economy. In line with the founder paradigm, textbooks emphasized Egypt within its modern borders as the site of history. So even when authors weave the history of neighboring Arab countries, especially throughout the late 50s and 60s, into the narrative, Egypt remained central. For example, the 1962 edition of Ahmed Izzat Abd al-Karim's text, Tarikh al-Arab al-Hadith, which, as the title suggests, is an Arab nationalist textbook, dedicated an entire chapter to the making of modern Egypt and included a section on Egypt in each chapter, giving Egypt's history preferential treatment over all the other Arab countries. Abd al-Karim's famous 1954 textbook claims that, quote, Egypt has contributed to the lion's share of the establishment of Arab and Islamic civilization, end quote. Textbooks also portrayed the Egyptian state as the main subject of history, irrespective of those in power. And so in one sense, all historical events either lead up to or emerge from this instance of the founding of modern Egypt by Muhammad Ali in the 19th century. Finally, mid-century textbooks tended to portray Egyptians as unchanging, nowhere is this more apparent than in their depictions of Egyptians' relationship to religion and agricultural land. Many textbooks claim that Egyptians are and have always been religious by nature. Saifuddin's text from 1960 states that every Egyptian, quote, fears God by nature. And these textbooks depicted Egyptians as an unchanging, civilized, settled agrarian society, and always juxtaposed them to the nomadic Bedouins, whom they portrayed as untrustworthy and disloyal. So for example, 57 textbook portrays Bedouins as thieves, while in 1937, and this is an older textbook, Rifat claimed that they were traitors. All Bedouins were traitors, right? Then we come to the second form of change or theme, which is revival and change. We've called it revival and change. By that we mean that these were themes that either had their roots in the pre-52 period and which were subsequently revived by the authors following the late 50s and 60s, or they were themes that they gradually and progressively altered slightly while maintaining the founder paradigm's modes of reasoning. We, in our paper, examined 5 examples: the Arabi Revolt, the 52 Revolution, ways that the people are represented, and Pan-Arabism. But because we don't have time, I will just focus here on the Arabi Revolt. For those who don't know, the 1881 Arabi Revolt is a very interesting prism to understand the influence of the Nasser regime and sort of understand the continuity in authorship and how that developed. So Arabi was a general who led the revolt against foreign intervention and royal corruption, a history that clearly resonated with the free officers. In 54, Saifuddin's primary school textbook expressed support for Arabi, stating that the general had, quote, fought against injustice. And every other author of the post-52 period presented a similar narrative. And these textbooks usually blame the British occupation that immediately followed the Arabi revolt on Khedive Ismail rather than Arabi. By contrast, many pre-52 textbooks tended to be critical of Arabi, often holding him responsible for the occupation and attributing his failure to the fact that he was a military man with political ambitions. And this we see in a 1912 textbook, which sort of says that Arabi's efforts actually led to factionalism and led to a power imbalance, etc. But given the plurality of narratives that the pre-52 era allowed for, some textbooks actually referred to his revolt as a nationalist movement, such as Saifuddin's 1933 textbook, and Duqmeri's 1949 textbook, which affirmed that Arabi had good intentions despite his limited education and modest political capabilities. So it's not a rosy depiction either, but it's better than the other ones I just mentioned. So one could perhaps even argue that Saifuddin and Duqmeri's rather warm positions towards Arabi pre-52 likely facilitated their smooth rehabilitation as textbook authors during the Nasr period. It's because they had these ideas beforehand. So when we compare pre- and post-52 texts, we can identify that many themes associated with the Nasr regime were variations upon older ones rather than completely new creations. And a strictly political approach would assume that the Nasr regime's political discourse was immediately mimicked in textbooks, while our analysis is able to complicate such assumptions by highlighting the intermittent and twisted roots that lead to such an apparent alignment. So these authors would often draw on content from the pre-52 era, but they would sort of borrow them, change them, and try to make them suit the consensus of the day. And then we come to the sort of new, final way that things were changed around, which is the idea of additions and omissions. So in some instances, of course, textbook authors immediately adopted political discourses by introducing completely novel or unprecedented themes. Such innovations normally came through new authorship, and especially, but not always at the preparatory level, as previously discussed, such as Abdul Karim's first textbook in 54, or Amin Arif's first textbook in 1960, and Abdulaziz Nawar and Prince Radwan's textbook in 76. In our article, we analyze how these authors introduced three new themes: socialism, democratic pluralism, and militarism. And I'll try to briefly summarize them for the sake of time. Following Sadat's economic liberalization policies, Abdulaziz Nawar and Prince Radwan's 76 textbook provided a new narrative that departed from the Nasr era narrative, which portrayed prosperity as a marker of economic success as opposed to social justice. To explain the 67 defeat against Israel, one textbook implicitly blamed Nasser and his leadership for having sided with self-interested, ostensibly socialist centers of power, but claimed that Sadat's policies built an economy on, quote, sound foundations. Abdul Karim's textbook from 54 provided the first ever rejection of multi-party governance and democratic pluralism. So this was also a new idea that emerges in this period. The authors explained that the competition among political parties had led to the British occupation in 1882, and this was echoed later on in a 69 textbook which sharpened this critique and which accused Egypt's pre-52 multi-party system of weakening the revolutionary spirit. And even textbooks from the 70s era still depicted that idea that having political parties was somehow bad for politics. And finally, there were instances in which things were omitted, not necessarily added. And this is the case with primary sources. So at the height of the centralization efforts, the Ministry of Education in 1960, remember the pamphlet I told you about where they talked about their curriculum policy? They openly stated that they had removed textbooks that they thought were dangerous to students. And among these, though the pamphlet does not state this directly, but I am almost 100% sure, was a textbook called Fusul Mukhtara min Kutub al-Tarikh, selected episodes from history textbooks, which Taha Hussein co-edited in 1954. This work was exceptional, consisting exclusively of primary sources, a 3-part series designed for 3 years of secondary school. The introduction to the work questioned the very authority of official history. He invites students to challenge historical narratives and critically engage with primary sources so as not to passively accept everything that they are told. Schools only used the mentioned textbook for only 3 years. Given the book's encouragement of critique and its subversive propositions about the nature of the discipline of history itself, it is unsurprising that the textbook committees removed it in 1958. One likely explanation for the textbook's appearance in the first place, as historian DPhil has noted, was that Hussein saw, quote, the celebration of the historic moment as a form of cultural threat, end quote, and therefore sought to challenge the kind of trajectory that he saw developing in the mid-50s. But there could be another explanation, which lies in the experimental nature of textbook production in the early post-52 moment. Taha Hussein was able to develop this textbook precisely because the bureaucratic structures still allowed for this sort of experimentation and plurality, at least until 58. Authors' inclusion of new themes suggests that they did not passively reproduce the same content, but sought to consciously adhere to some of the Nasser regime's most important values. It was typically first-time textbook authors who introduced new themes, as I stated. And once these new authors introduced novelties, they did not disappear easily. But ultimately, none of these novel themes altered the founder paradigm meta-narrative, and that's sort of why there is this continuity. One noticeable exception was perhaps Taha Hussein's text, which, as noted above, the committees hastily removed only 3 years after its introduction, potentially due to its threat, and also its threat to the founder paradigm itself, right? So that's also interesting. So to conclude, through an in-depth analysis of history textbooks, as well as their author, our work has tried to demonstrate how Egypt's established bureaucratic structure shaped the development of textbooks over time. It identifies compliance and alignment between changes in political discourse and textbook content, but emphasizes fractures and tensions between them. As Laurie Brand astutely argues, textbook development is a complicated and messy process that cannot always be neatly mapped onto politics. Textual analysis alone is insufficient to explain this complex relationship, and so is a broader discourse historical approach if it only focuses on the parallels between political discourse and textbooks without shedding light on the nuances and inner workings of the institutions responsible for them. With our focus on the bureaucratic history behind textbook development, we hope to provide a fresh and understudied perspective of the dynamics at play. And by exploring authorship and the institutional framework of textbook production, we actually present a story of experimentation, creativity, but also, as always, continuity. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Farida, for this very interesting talk and the way because it's very, we usually think of textbooks in these very political chronologies, and I think it's very interesting to think differently. And I have maybe several questions, but I'll start maybe with one or two questions. You, in the beginning of your talk, so you talked about a bit about the trajectories, training of the historians or like people who wrote these textbooks. What about the later period? The people who wrote, who wrote textbooks in the 60s, 70s. What do we know about their training, their trajectories, their like networks? And so you stop in the 1980. So why 1980? Is there like a shift, a bureaucratic? Because you point to this like 1960 centralization. So does this affect the way textbooks were written for this whole period until the 1980? And what happened in 1980, which is significant. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Malak. So I'll actually start with your second question, why 1980? So that was actually an arbitrary position because we realized that we needed to have a cutoff point. And so we were thinking, okay, Mubarak comes to power is our cutoff point. But actually, some of these textbooks continued well into the 90s. But it was also informed by some of the conversations we had with the people who work at the Ministry of Education's archive as well. Because we tried to ask them, in your opinion, you know, what was the period that witnessed the most changes and the most frequent changes? And so they said, well, starting the second half of the 80s, the Mubarak era, that's when they start changing things more rapidly. And then it's almost like you don't have a handle anymore on how frequent the changes can be. So it was a bit of an arbitrary, we had to stop at some point. We were looking at textbooks from 1912 until, you know, and so at some point we were like, enough, we'd seen so many. So that was a bit of an arbitrary point, but it was to mark the end of the Sadat years. And yeah, we could have continued, but yeah. So that's regarding the first question. As for the trajectory of those who wrote textbooks in the 1960s, so I would argue that they were trained in similar fashion to that earlier period in the sense that you either had academic historians who were employed or co-authored or became part of the committees. So these were people who would be employed at the Egyptian university teaching history, but who are then invited to contribute to a textbook. Or you had the ministry inspectors, again, so these are people whose professional trajectory starts within the ministry and they ascend up to the ministers, and so they make up the majority of the committee as well. And again, so for example, the case of Saifuddin is one of them. So he starts writing these books in the 30s, and up until the 60s, he's still author. So it's 30 years of a career spent writing history textbooks. A majority of them also as well.
I have a question, Farida. Thank you for. When you talk about experimentation of ideas, the curricula, do you think at the time they thought this was experimentation, or this is what you concluded from your research? What do you think about this?
I don't think they necessarily saw themselves as necessarily experimenting. I think perhaps, for example, in the case, and I'm speculating because I don't know, I don't know how I would find out. But so in the case of Taha Hussein and his book, which is, you know, very, very critical of the very discipline of history itself, invites students to think about, you know, I mean, it's the introduction of the book starts with Taha Hussein saying, if you're sitting in a classroom, you might hear a story by your teacher, but then you go back home and your father tells you, or a parent tells you the story in a completely different way. Where does the truth lie? And basically the conclusion is there is no truth, almost, you know. So, I mean, you know, so I'm assuming he was either testing the waters, testing the limits of how much he would have been able to say at the time, or he was just practicing the same level of openness that was expected from textbook authors before. So not knowing that there was going to be a limit to that form of practice of being a bit more critical. I mean, there are a lot of examples from the pre-52 period that we didn't discuss in the presentation, but they're in the article. There are examples where the origin of Egyptians as being like one Egyptian, and tries to say that Egyptians are multifaceted and they come from different ethnicities. I mean, again, in the 1930s, you have a textbook that praises Egyptians who revolted against the indigenous pharaohs, and talks about how they went into temples and erased the picture of the king, of the pharaoh. So not the picture, the engraving. You know what I mean? So because that was possible before, it's possible that you know, especially in the 50s, they were just carrying out what they used to do before, not exactly knowing where the limit was, or they knew that there was a limit and they were trying to test it. But I don't think they necessarily saw themselves as experimenting, yeah.
In the 60s, I think there's a shift, not only in the education. I mean, we see in what I look at, like economy a bit and public sector, etc. We see a shift in terms of centralization and bureaucracy. In the 60s, I think, is a shift that needs to be in not only education. I think so. Yeah.
Yes, and there are a lot of parallels also with the culture, what happens in the establishment of the Ministry of Culture, and then what happens there. I mean, it's all very telling. There's this attempt to control.
Yeah, it follows up with these questions, and I'm wondering if we were to think about the figure of al-mufattish, al-inspector, pre-52 and post-50, do they exist pre-52 as well? So then it would be interesting to think of him as how in the 60s they became a certain thing and it continues into the 80s, but then what were how did the criteria differ beforehand for the mufattish to allow the kind of plurality in that same bureaucracy of the Ministry of Education? And I really think this approach of the bureaucracy helps to كده show a different nature. You've got me curious, and you know so much. فيعني احكي لنا شوي.
So your question is like, what kind of training would they have had, or like what kind of?
المفتش is someone who is صارم, يعني someone who is كده very disciplinary and controlled,
right.
And it makes sense. You know, in the 60s something encouraged that kind of figure to become al-mufattish. But I'm curious what existed beforehand. Yani what was this flourishing moment?
Yeah, I think there were two. So I'm going to talk about the pre-52 period because I feel like I know a bit more about it. You have, I would say, maybe two levels of inspector. You have like the elite inspector and the inspector. So the inspector is the one who has to go to all of the different schools and make sure that they're doing the curriculum correctly and that they're using the right colored pen. And they're the ones there are a lot of anecdotes about how awful they are. You know, there was a conference in the 1940s where a lot of teachers came together and basically they complained for like hours about the inspectors. They're like, they came and they wanted my students to use blue pens. What's this stupid blue pen? You know, and they have like, you know, they complain about the inspectors. So I don't think that these like, let's call them like the lower echelons of the bureaucracy, the ones who go to the schools, they're not necessarily the ones who are writing the textbooks. The ones who are writing the textbooks are the more elite ones who are inspectors of a particular subject. Right, so because you have an inspector who goes to the schools, and then you have like مفتش اللغة العربية, for example, and so that's a more prestigious position within the ministry where they might have the opportunity to produce a textbook, and they're not going to go down and check out the schools, etc. And so that it's a more I'm not going to call it an academic position per se, but it's a more sort of علمية, you know, like it's a more conceptual job, I think. Although the teachers do complain about them too, but I would say, I don't think so, because you have I think that once you have these star historians, especially in the 60s and 70s, when you have Ahmed Aizat Abdikarim and others, once they author a text, it's also very difficult for the ones in the committee who are from the bureaucracy to kind of say, no, we're not gonna, you know, because it's Dr. Ahmed, you know. So it's very difficult for them to, I think, so I don't know, but I think that in the 60s and 70s, you continue to have that mix, that very interesting mix between the inspectors who are on the committee and the professors. And very often when you look at the textbooks themselves, it will say authored by, and then the first author is usually someone who's an academic, and then everybody else is usually mufattish al-tarikh, or, you know, something like that. المفتش بوزارة التربية والتعليم or سابقا المفتش بوزارة المعارف, things like that. Yeah, there was a هناك وهنا.
I wanted to ask if throughout your research you found anything to point towards why they were so determined to be so nationalistic in their textbooks.
That's a very big question. So I think, well, I mean, motivated by a lot of different reasons. I think definitely the let's call it the post-54 moment, for example. There is a need to, these authors have a need to kind of please the regime of the day, right? So especially the new ones who are coming to the stage for the first time, they're trying to produce content that is what they think will be in line with the regime. So there's that. But throughout, there's always been a sense that education needs to be used in order to produce young nationalist kids who will be good citizens, right? So the idea has always been present, and so you know, as far back as the early 20th century, you have that recurring theme. So it doesn't go away at all. Actually, it's quite persistent throughout.
Thank you for the lecture, Dr. Farida. I have an idea. For example, the Mamluk area, by analyzing manuscripts.
So you're asking about whether we can...
الهجية دي ولا لا؟
I mean, whenever you have primary sources, there are sets of rules that you have to apply in order to analyze them. These, I mean, there's a huge academic debate about whether or not these rules are good or bad, but they're there. And so you have to sort of, yeah, I mean, you always have to use the same sets of rules to look at the sources and see if they make sense, if there is some sort of a misalignment between what one source says and the other one says. Is there a discrepancy? Is the source accurate? Who is the author? What would they, you know, do they have an interest, a political interest or otherwise, to say this in this particular time period? So but these tools that we have as historians are applicable across time. The problem is, the further you go back in time, the less sources you have. So if you're a historian of the first century, you have a problem because you don't have a lot of sources. And so you have to kind of make up a lot of stuff and compare from other, you know, I did not say make up. Nobody makes up. We're not making up anything. But, you know, you just have to be, you have a more difficult time. And obviously, if you're a historian of the last 20 years, you have a very easy time to, unless they're not giving you permission to access the sources, but that's another story. But usually you will have a lot of materials. So, yeah. So it's the same, it's more or less the same methodology. There are entire historians' debates about whether these methodologies are good or bad. The anthropologists don't like them very often. It's okay, we use them and we're good.
Thank you.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I have two questions. The first one is, I'm a bit confused. How many textbooks did you look at? Because my understanding is there's one history textbook for every grade, and probably the same textbook stays for the same grade for a few years. But you made it sound like there are a lot of textbooks, so I was just curious if you could elaborate on that. And the second question, maybe I wasn't paying attention, but what's the process for approving a textbook? Because you said there's a committee, but then you said that there's authors. So does one author carry more weight than the others? Are there levels of review within the ministry? You didn't mention if there was a change in the type of review that the ministry does to approve new textbooks in different eras. So if you could elaborate a bit on like the process for actually getting a new textbook approved and into schools.
Okay. Thank you for the question. So in terms of the number of textbooks, there are a lot. And this is because it seems, and the problem is when you go to the Ministry of Education's archive, is that they only list the year in which a particular textbook was, like when it was introduced, but it doesn't necessarily tell you when the textbook ceased to be used by this particular school grade. Okay, so it would be like a history textbook for the second preparatory school year, and then you don't exactly know. The only way you can know is to look at when there's another introduction of another textbook, and then if the titles are more or less similar, even if the authors are different, you can then assume that they changed the book. In the earlier period, there seems to have been a much larger plurality of textbooks. It seems like there were several ones and that there was a bit more freedom to choose from these different ones, or maybe to use them all at the same time. It also seems in the earlier period that you didn't have one, so the teacher would use several books, basically. They were all approved by the, pre-52, especially the 1920s, 30s, there seems to have been a lot more textbooks in circulation than before. The problem at the ministry is that, and that this is also to answer your second question, I was not granted access to the National Archives. So I don't have the inner workings and the proceedings of the different committees, for example, that were there. I don't know if these documents exist, maybe they do, but if so, I've never seen them. And at the Ministry of Education, unfortunately, they don't have these reports. So I don't know what the process was for review. But what I can say is that from my hunch, and again, this is speculation, when you had an author who was an academic historian, for example, then usually I think can بيحصل له زي تكليف, so he would be assigned to write this, or someone would call him, you know, something like that. And I think that the ministry inspectors would then make sure that the content is aligned with what they want to say, especially in this post-52 period, let's say. Before that, it seems to me, the fact that you had a textbook which praised Egypt's multi-ethnic origin, how did that fly? I don't know. This is the height of, Egyptian nationalism in the 30s and 40s. I don't, you know what I mean? So I don't think the review process was, or I don't know how the review process went. Unfortunately, I don't have access to this information.
Farida, can we take one of the questions online? So Nadra Zaki is asking you if you observed if there was a colonialist influence before 1952 on the curricula.
Yeah, sorry, because I can't see without my glasses. Certain topics that were changed rapidly.
This is the first question, and the second question was there certain topics that were changed rapidly, like now after the 2011? And she's also interested to know about the co-curricula of Syria and Egypt. What were the intersections, if there were any?
Okay, so if I observed before 52, there was colonialist influence. There was, because most of the research we did started post 1923, so this is the period in which most of the textbooks are now being authored by Egyptians. And so for example, you had one history textbook that was co-authored between Ghurbel and someone who's non-Egyptian. I don't remember his name, but this was an exception. So in this sense, I would say it was also a very particular political moment in which this Egyptian bureaucracy of the ministry really saw it as a golden opportunity to start asserting itself and to start, and this is how they speak normally, finally, being in control of the material, right? And so because that's their sentiment, like finally we are in control, this is reflected in the textbooks. And so most of them actually are, if they're one thing, they're more nationalistic than they are sort of Orientalist or sort of self-hating or any of that. So that's regarding the first question. If certain topics were changed rapidly, yeah. So there was another research project that I was involved with about 10 years ago with EIPR, which was a textbook study on the changes in textbooks post-2011. And in that study, we actually argued that it still took time. So because it's very difficult to change these committees very quickly. So the easiest thing you can do is omit something, right? So this is like the easiest change you can do because it doesn't really require for you to bring together a completely new committee from scratch and author something from scratch, because that actually takes time. You need at least one academic year to prepare. So I think what happens in 2011 is that certain things are scratched. So some references to Mubarak disappear quite quickly, I think within the first year or so. And then you have the period where the Muslim Brotherhood take over, and again, you see some changes here and there, but it's not, they don't last because they're only there for a year. So again, there isn't time to, change radically yet, right? And so yeah, but then you start seeing a lot of changes very quickly later on. I mean, it then moves on very quickly from that point onwards. And the curricula between Syria and Egypt, they were exactly the same. So the same curriculum that you had more or less in Egypt was the same one that was designed for Syria. It was included because it was an Arab history textbook. Remember, so this is the era of having the sort of Tarikh al-Arab, right? And so you would have Syrian history, of course, and all of the others. But it was the same textbook, as far as I know, unless someone from Syria can rectify that information.
Maybe we take another question here. Sarah, yeah. So in 1937, 1938, there was a radical change in textbooks of drawing education in secondary schools. Are there similar changes in textbooks of other subjects?
Yeah, this is an interesting, so because this paper was mostly focused on history textbooks, and we were trying to understand how they operate, and of course other subjects have other influences, right? Because of the professionals or the experts in the field are always very different, and so it's a bit of a different story. In 37, 38, what happens with the drawing and so with the art and drawing textbooks is that what I would argue is that this is much more influenced by the conversations around progressive education, which is actually the topic of my work, and the kinds of conversations that are happening at the level of the ministry itself, because there's a consensus that Egyptian education should move towards progressive education. I can spend years talking about what progressive education is, so we don't have to do this now, but in any event, it's just to say that I feel like these changes were very much part of that conversation. But I will emphasize again that the kinds of changes that we see in the pre-52 era are, I'm going to call them sporadic. So there's a sense of we need to change the art curriculum now, and so we'll set up a committee to do that. But we're never going to change everything at the same time, right? So you will continue. Whereas we're going to change everything at the same time, or at least we're going to revise everything and make sure that it's all aligned with one policy. That only comes in the late 1950s, as I've discussed. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I have a question. Because currently I think textbooks history textbooks don't cover very recent history, like post 2011. It's not covered, right, in history curricula. I think so, right? So in post 1952. So what in terms of when do they start discussing these textbooks, discussing 1952 and like the narrative around 1952? When does it appear in the textbooks?
I would say it appears early on. It appears in 54 with these inaugural texts of Ahmad Aizat Abdul Karim or Abul Futuh Radwan, with these preparatory level texts that starts there. And it continues, but interestingly, 1952, it gets less and less pages as you progress in the 70s. So it gets less and less importance. And regarding 2011, I'm pretty sure that some of the textbooks between 2011 and today did mention, they had a chapter on 2011, but that was removed. The problem is I haven't followed the current texts in a while, and because I haven't been doing textbooks in a very long time. So I don't know exactly today, but I think you're right. I think this was completely removed, but it did exist briefly in some of the textbooks, maybe around 2014, 2013, something like that, 13, 14, 15, and then it disappeared.
Final questions? Okay, thank you very much, Farida, for this great talk.
Thank you very much.
And yeah, I learned a lot personally. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.